Our next panel is Red Alert: Unmasking Russia's Security Challenge to the Transatlantic Community. Please allow me to invite our speakers to join us. Mark Galeotti, Executive Director of Mayak Intelligence. The next one is Nikolas GVOSDEV, Professor at US Naval War College. And the third one is Iuliia OSMOLOVSKA, Head of GLOBSEC Kyiv office. They will join us shortly. Let me set the scene until they do. For the next 40 minutes, we will be unmasking Russia's security challenge to the transatlantic community. We all see and hear daily the consequences of Russia's action in Ukraine, the scale of it. But Russia's war, except from security, has also had a profound impact on global economy and the welfare of billion people around the world, on energy and food security, nuclear safety, on the environment. Since the war against Ukraine shattered peace and gravely altered the security environment, the NATO was clear in its message. The Russian Federation is the most significant and direct threat to allies' security and to the peace and stability in Euro-Atlantic area. And NATO does not seek confrontation and poses no threat to Russia, but will continue to respond to Russian threats. I hope my speakers won't mind if I continue this panel discussion with addressing them by their first name. Thank you so much. Mr. Galeotti or Mark, let's start with the political perspectives that are driving the Kremlin challenge to the West.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting that if one listens to Putin's rhetoric these days, essentially this is a grand global struggle. This is not actually a war in, or even, as he would put it, against Ukraine. This is actually Russia defending itself against a West that is trying to undermine, marginalize, and even dismantle the Russian Federation. And Ukraine is just the most visible and kinetic of a whole series of global battlefields. So that is the current rhetorical line. In part, this is clearly just an alibi, an explanation as to why what was intended as a brief, neat fait accompli in Ukraine has turned into a lengthy and, from Russia, I would suggest, unwinnable war. But it is more than that. I mean, I think it does represent the fact that Putin, if not necessarily the mass of the Russian elite or people, has indeed come to internalize this notion that Russia is in a politically existential struggle. And therefore, if we look at actually what the threat is, I think from Putin's point of view, this is not actually about, further invasions, territorial gains, or whatever, even if his military was in fit state to do that. It is rather about, as he would see it, breaking the model, the unipolar, US-dominated Western world order, and creating one in which national sovereignty is essentially something that is dependent on how strong you are. So strong countries will naturally impose their will upon weaker ones. It's of creating a world in which Russia is recognized as a great power, and it's recognizing a world in which our concepts of international law and the like do not apply. Mm-hmm. And I think so that is really how I would frame it. Yes, it's actually about a struggle against Ukraine and a struggle for Putin's own political survival, but he's now framing it in much wider systemic terms as one in which, essentially the future of the world is at stake.
Mm-hmm. Iuliia, the world is becoming militarily and politically more and more dangerous, from hybrid to atomic. So except from the obvious one, what do you see as the main Russia's security challenge to the transatlantic community?
Yes, let me try to answer your question from a bit psychological point of view, and say that I would see the main Russia security challenge to the transatlantic community in ever-growing assertiveness based on greed for imperial ambitions to divide and rule in Eurasia mainland, and phantom pains for dissolved USSR and territories of the countries that become independent, inability of Russia to accept this new reality. And this actually could be leading to a desire to dominate as a global power, like Mark Galeotti said. Therefore, this threat of security and stability in Europe always will be there. And this will be there also because of the competitive character, like Russia views the world. So it's not about like cooperation or win-win models of engagement. It's rather about power struggle, which you also can see in their negotiation approaches. And actually, there should be periods of snow breaks in relations, which could be defined by relative Russia weakness, the period when Russia is quite weak, or there is a trend to pseudo liberalized approaches in engagement with the West, as we've seen in some historical periods in the past. But basically, the war in Ukraine clearly shown that the real ambitions to divide and rule in Europe are still there. The leopard will never change its spots, and actually this growing assertiveness also is being explained by the humiliation that Russia is receiving now in Ukraine, and seeing that it is not losing to Ukraine, but it is losing to the entire Euro-Atlantic community.
As Iuliia said, it's not about cooperation, but about power struggle. Nikolas, talking about Russia's behavior against its neighbors and against the wider transatlantic community, the challenge is not only security one, it's also geo-economic. What does this include?
Well, thank you very much, and pleasure to be here, and I'll offer my own thoughts on this question. Look, Russia under Putin has seen economic tools no less than military and hybrid power and subversive tools as part of its toolkit for influencing others, exerting power, trying to change the course, as both Iuliia and Mark have pointed out, a very 19th century view of the international system where great powers do what they wish and smaller powers have to accept what the great powers dish out. And part of this has been that Russia sees itself and has positioned itself as a key supplier of important commodities to the world economy, starting with energy, food, minerals, all sorts of parts that the advanced economies require in order to sustain themselves. And so what we've seen over the last number of years is a Russian effort, in essence, to, as Iuliia said, try to divide Europe by essentially being able to say, we sit on top of the supply chains which power your economies, which enable you to have a standard of living. And if you don't want to accede to our demands or what we wish, we can cut them off. If you sanction us, we will find ways around those sanctions, and we will turn to other suppliers. And most importantly, we can help the rise of other economic centers in the world, starting with China, by being able to offer them
so talking about sanctions, Nikolas, did it work?
Resources. So the challenge also for the West is not just simply how to meet the Russian challenge, but also how to then substitute, how to find alternate sources of the energies and commodities that the Western economies require in order to remain both economically competitive, but also to generate the security tools that we need to defend the Euro-Atlantic world.
Talking about sanctions, Nikolas, did they work? There were rounds and rounds of sanctions. They were also felt in the countries that were imposing them on Russia. How do you see the situation now?
I think the problem was, and has always been with regard to Russia sanctions, is that Western policymakers have always oversold them, what they can do, what they could achieve. It's very clear that the sanctions imposed by the West have impacted Russia. They've impacted Russia negatively. Russia has less income. Russia has less access. Putin has talked a lot in the past about the development of the Russian Arctic as the key to Russia remaining one of the great powers. And the sanctions that have been imposed have cut Russia off from the European finance and technology that he needs for the Arctic to be developed. So there's no doubt that sanctions have had an impact. The question is, have they had a sufficient impact to change behavior, to essentially compel the Kremlin to move in a different direction? And there, as you've noted, the record is mixed. And the issue, of course, is that sanctioning powers have to be able to absorb the costs of the counter sanctions. And in some cases here, I think that the West underestimated the impact of sanctions on compelling Russian behavior and perhaps didn't factor in as much what the costs might be for the United States, for different states in Europe to impose these sanctions. And certainly that is part of Russia's soft power, sharp power tools in trying to divide Europe by suggesting and reaching out directly to try to manipulate populations that their economic hard times are in some ways related to the sanctions that they have imposed on Russia.
Mark, how far do internal politics in divisions within Russia influence its foreign operations?
This is the kind of question which I'm going to give the very unsatisfying answer at once: a lot and very little. On the one hand, the basic thrust of policy is absolutely fixed by Putin and the increasingly small circle of people that he actually listens to. And on the whole, these are people of the same kind of mindset. Most of them actually are the same KGB background. They are still, I would suggest, sort of psychologically scarred by the end of empire at the end of 1991. And that has metastasized into a sense of anger and resentment against the sort of the West that I think has basically been the source of their problems. So, grand policy is essentially set by them. However, how that's operationalized, how that actually sort of is then sort of applied in whether it's in terms of the battlefield in Ukraine or in terms of policy in other countries, there it's actually a much more interesting situation, because we do see that this is a modern 21st century institutionalized state which is run by an almost medieval court at the very top. And within that court, there are all kinds of actors who basically are trying to enrich themselves. They're trying to increase their own political power. They are prosecuting feuds against their rivals. And we see actually that there's been a fragmentation of policy in many ways. If you look at, for example, policy towards the Balkans specifically, this is clearly an area where instead of the Russian foreign ministry, it's Nikolai Patrushev, the exceedingly hawkish secretary of the Russian Security Council, who essentially has acquired a sort of the dominant role. If one looks at Syria, it's the defense ministry. If one looks at Venezuela, it's Igor Sechin, the head of Rosneft, the hydrocarbons sort of giant. So, in this respect, we can see degrees of nuance. We can see competition between different actors. But the problem is that ultimately this is a system in which the only real currency is Putin's favor. And for these people, they're all trying to essentially curry favor with the boss. They're trying to impress Putin, show that they have ideas, that they have capacities. And so although they're often operating at cross purposes, they're often trying to enrich themselves in the process, they're all trying to basically show Putin that they are his most effective, his toughest, his most committed supporters, because that way they acquire impunity from their crimes and enrichment for their lives. So this is why it's an interestingly complex one. We have a single applied policy from above, but it's kind of refracted through the self-interest and the ambitions of all kind of different institutions and actors. It's not carefully coordinated.
Iuliia, are both sides of the Atlantic at the same side when it comes to Russia's security challenge, or are there differences in approach that you see?
Yeah, I would say that currently we observe a tendency that the both sides of the Atlantic are on the same page. But there might be slight deviations to the previous position some of the countries used to take in some point in the future. So let me explain to you briefly what I mean by that. So basically, at the beginning of the war, definitely we saw a clear division of perception of this threat coming from Russia. From the countries of the Central and Eastern Europe had this experience of dealing with the Russia and Soviet times, and especially to have this experience of Russian troops being present in these countries. And these countries obviously were the most keen supporters of Ukraine, and they were acting as a sort of engines for driving this consolidated position of the support from the Western countries. Whereas for countries like France, like Germany, Iberian countries, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Russia is a bit of a distant threat. So they don't perceive this as sensitive as it had been perceived by the Central and Eastern European countries. United States had always been the supporter for Ukraine as well as like United Kingdom, but for a bit different reasons. Like we mentioned already, great power competition and against the background of the Afghanistan situation. So I think that for United States, this support to Ukraine had multidimensional aspects from this point of great power games. And actually, eventually, as I've been told recently in Brussels, it is because of the Zelensky personally and all the Ukrainians, we finally managed to get this very strong and consolidating position of all the transatlantic community to support Ukraine and to commit to support Ukraine as long as it takes. However, we shouldn't exclude the psychological factor of a sort of like a relative fatigue, so getting used to an irritator, and that this position might be fluctuating in moods with the length of time, especially when there are some political changes in different countries, like we see, for instance, right now in Slovakia. The recent statements that Slovakia is not going to supply Ukraine any longer with military equipment politically is seen as a sign of not supporting and deviating Slovakia from this consolidated position. However, it physically might be explained by the simple fact that Slovakia has given almost everything that it could already to Ukraine when it comes to the military equipment. So basically, to sum up, currently we experience the highest possible level of consolidated position and perception of Russia as a threat by different actors within this transatlantic community. However, we not excluding the risks of deviation of particular countries within this unity, and Ukraine is actually right now is doing a lot to maintain and to keep this unity and to keep this issue highly on the agenda.
Iuliia, you mentioned the psychological and also the political view of the situation. Do you think that the understanding of the reality can be the same for the people who have a gun to their head and for the ones who are trying to help, but also to avoid having a gun to theirs?
No, definitely not. Very good question, Yasmin, because I can give you my own example. When the war in Georgia happened in 2008, Ukrainian helped Georgia with the military equipment, with the armory. Ukrainians had been very sympathetic to Georgians, but we were not as into the situation as we faced ourselves in February 2022, when we realized the actual real sound of the engines of military helicopters, Russian troops descending on your land in front of your eyes, and so on. So it definitely makes a big difference when you speak from the point of witnessing the event or hearing this missile sound or remnants falling on your head, and you just think, are you going to die or alive after that? And therefore, there is this challenge, this psychological challenge for us to keep this attention and support from the European community, especially those of distant countries. But we will do our utmost, realizing this effect, to keep the support as high as it can.
Nikolas, how successful is Russia in its intention to act as a spoiler, disruptor, all along the edges of the Euro-Atlantic world? What are Russian focal points of interest in this area, and how does that affect the transatlantic community?
Well, that's always been part of the Russian strategy, is to create pressure and problems on the periphery as a way to influence developments in Europe. And essentially, in the past, and we saw this with the refugee crisis, with Syria, with Libya, to say that Russia needs to be part of the solution, so to speak, in order to spare the European core these negative impacts. So the idea that, well, don't sanction Russia as much because then Russia might do something and then there could be more refugees crossing the Mediterranean. So that's been part of the strategy in the past. Moving forward, I think we have to shift that Russia is aware, or at least some in the Russian government are aware, that time is not on Russia's side with regard to where Russia is positioned in the global economy. And we have these new projects, the middle corridor running from Central Asia through the Caspian and Black Sea into Southeastern Europe, into the Balkans, these very new ambitious proposals for the India, Indonesia to the Middle East again, and then into Europe again through Southeastern Europe as the points for these new corridors for trade, for resources. And I think increasingly, Russia will try to disrupt those linkages, to try to prevent the Euro-Atlantic world, but more specifically Europe, from gaining access to alternate sources of resources. And so whether it's the coup in Niger, which was impacts plans for a trans-Sahara gas pipeline, whether it's activities in the Black Sea, attempting to make that a no-go zone for trade, Russia will try to create these pressure points on the periphery of the Euro-Atlantic community, going back again to, as Iuliia said, to try to divide opinion in Europe and to get people to say, we've done too much, this is too costly for us, we should have some degree of a settlement with Russia in order to try to go back to a pre-2022 relationship. And that's, again, we can see some of the outlines with that in what Russia has been doing in other parts of the world.
Mark, coming back to the topic that you covered, do we have a Putin problem or a Russia problem? Looking ahead, will Russia continue to be the most significant and direct threat to allies' security as NATO is defining it now in the post-Putin era?
Yes, this is one of the issues that very much, I think, dramatically divides the expert and policy communities. Myself, I'm more of the view that we have a Putin and a Putin's generation problem. If one looks at the next political generation, on the whole, look, these are not nice people. These are not natural democrats. These are ruthless, opportunistic kleptocrats. Of course, the interesting thing is that this war is very bad for business for most, though not all, of the kleptocrats. You know, at the risk of trivializing it, what's the point in stealing on an industrial scale if you can't then moor your yacht off the coast of Italy, if you can't go to or buy your agreeable penthouse in central London, if you can't send your kids to an American university? From their point of view, you know, I think that there is a sense in which, yes, they are not interested in democratizing Russia, they're not interested in rule of law, but they would be interested in improving relations simply so that they can get back to the good old days of early Putinism, when they could steal at home and bank and spend abroad. The thing is, of course, it's whether or not this political generation is actually able to take over in the foreseeable future. You know, if Putin himself is in a position to manage his own succession, and there's no signs at the moment that he plans to step down, I don't believe he can, because the risks to him would be too great. But if he does manage his succession, he will presumably pick someone whom he thinks shares his vision for Russia. But in the longer term, look, I mean, there is ample evidence that the Russian people themselves, while not being anywhere near as horrified as we might hope about what's happening in Ukraine, but nonetheless, you know, are not willing to see continued massive costs for a war that they don't truly understand. We have, you know, again, broadly speaking, maybe a quarter of Russians are supportive of the war genuinely, a quarter are opposed, and a half, frankly, are somewhere in a muddy middle. So I think it's very much, we should not play down to Putin's own tactic, which is to more or less suggest, look, you think I'm bad? Just think how terrible someone else would be. I think actually Putin and the people around Putin are as bad for the West and the rest of the world as really we can expect. So from my point of view, I think we should assume this is more of a Putin problem, but that does not mean that suddenly, as soon as he goes, we instantly transition into an era of peace and harmony. It will always be a rocky issue, especially, and this is my final point, so long as the Ukrainians understandably and rightly are looking for not just an end to the fighting, but also justice. Justice for the war criminals, justice in terms of reparations. I mean, these are inevitably going to be friction points in the future, whoever is in the Kremlin.
Yeah. Iuliia, let's keep on moving, looking forward. Will Russia, do you think, emerge from this war weak and isolated from politics to economy, but also other aspects, cultural, scientific, sports, and so on, or not? And talking about the new security architecture, where do you see Russia after the war? Will it be part of an Asian world where China is the dominant power?
Yes, thank you very much. So basically, yes, I would answer that Russia will be weak politically, isolated after this war, even in the eyes of Russia itself. Because for Russia, it's always been the case of belong to the club of the most advanced, technologically advanced, the most modern part of the world, like they still treat transatlantic community. They can say a lot of mean words about transatlantic community countries, the system of values and so on. But believe me, from psychological point, Russians are very much triggered by the fact that they've been excluded from these communications, from G7, from G20, and all this kind of stuff. And their efforts just to show that life goes on, and they've been, so not the entire world supports Ukraine, but just a part of it, the Western civilization, but the other part in very good contacts with Russia itself. So this is just a poor game and pretension and intention to show that everything is normal. Just take the simple fact. Russia is all alone in this war. The closest ally, Belarus, officially hasn't joined Russia in this war. With the recent so-called elections in the newly occupied territories in September, only 2 countries in the world have recognized these elections: Syria and North Korea. That's it. With the recent Putin initiative to withdraw himself from the grain initiative, the new kind of like a freeze relations with the African countries is coming into the picture. So I think that altogether on this political and diplomatic and other stuff, Russia will be drifting away from the very good productive communications on the world scale. However, and the same goes for the culture and sport, probably at less visible manner. When it comes to the culture, I would like to recall one of the famous letters written by Elena Pshenichna in Ukraine, describing all these horrors and massacres of Russia in Irpin and Bucha through the lenses of Russian culture, or the bombing of Mariupol theater, where more than 1,000 of children had been killed, despite the sign that there had been children. So I think that this trend is quite certain for a certain period of time, and as long as the issue of the adjustment and punishment for war crimes will be ongoing, I would agree this totally with Mark. However, Russians will be trying to play this differently. When it comes to the place of Russia in the security architecture in the Euro-Asian mainland, I highly doubt that Russia will be drifting exclusively to Asia, first under the subordination of China, which they don't want to have. They would like to see a sort of like equal relations, which is not possible with a partner like China. On the other hand, the psychological trigger that I mentioned, Russians always wanted to belong to the most advanced part of the world, like transatlantic community, and they do cherish this relation, and it's very painful for them to understand that they are excluded. So basically, I would assume a sort of, when they change in the power in Russia, there will be tendency to move closer to transatlantic community, but we have to be aware about the real motives behind this.
Thank you, Iuliia. Nikolas, how do you see the Russian role as spoiler disruptor in the Western Balkan region?
I think it's important to note that despite the setbacks Russia has faced in Ukraine, that Russia does not cease to be active in many different parts of the world, and that the Western Balkans still remains critical. As I noted before, this is where many of these new corridors linking specifically Europe through the Eastern Mediterranean to the Indo-Pacific are running. And if you can create disruption, if you can create uncertainty, both whether it's through media efforts, whether through its getting political parties that are more aligned to your point of view elected, whether it's using these geoeconomic tools, Russia will continue to do that because ultimately, and this goes back to a point that Iuliia has been raising, the fear that Russia has and has always had is that it will be not one of the agenda-setting powers, that it won't be able to set an agenda for European security, that it will be excluded from that, and that it won't have a seat at the table. And so it's looking for ways to ensure that it still has those seats at the table. I would just also note, though, that in reverse, this is also why the transatlantic, Euro-Atlantic agenda for the East cannot rest on what we think will come in Russia, who might succeed Putin, how close Russia gets to China or not. But there has to be a positive agenda for incorporating Ukraine, for extending the Black to Caspian Sea corridors, for strengthening the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western Balkans, which does not rest upon who governs in Moscow. And I think that both the discussions at forums like this conference, but moving onward, this is going to be the challenge for the United States and its European partners, is to move ahead on this positive agenda for incorporation, for extension, and for building up of these tools and these networks, because relying on regime change in Moscow or hoping that that Russia becomes more cooperative is a hope, but not a strategy.
We'll be talking about China's military rise and its ripple effect on European security at our next panel starting at noon. Before that, we will have a short coffee break. But at this moment, I would like to ask if there are some questions from the audience for our speakers. No? Then I think we have it wrapped up. Thank you so much for your contribution to this To Be Secure panel here in Montenegro. Maybe next year we will be here together in person.